The Wisconsin Paper Council is the premier trade association which advocates for Wisconsin's paper, pulp, and forestry industries before state and federal elected officials and regulators. The WPC also works to educate the general public and the media about the importance of pulp, paper, and forestry production in Wisconsin and throughout the Midwest. Welcome to our third episode of the Wisconsin Paper Council's podcast, The Paper Files, where we explore the pulp and paper industry here in Wisconsin. I'm Michaela Chafin, Research and Development Analyst here at Wisconsin Paper Council, and joining me here today to discuss the history of the paper industry in Wisconsin and the geographical impacts from the paper industry is Dr. Katie Weichelt, author of The Paper, a historical geography of the paper industry in the Wisconsin River Valley. Thank you for joining me today. Firstly, the perspective of your paper is through a geographical lens, but it goes into so much more than that, the sociological and economic impacts, as well as some personal stories of settlers starting their lives around Wisconsin and the rivers through Wisconsin. And the paper industry has truly made a significant impression on Wisconsin, and yet there are very few texts on this topic. You mentioned in the paper that few studies have examined the papermaking industry's history and the communities that developed around it. And during my own research, I found that to be true, with Wisconsin being the number one papermaking state and having such a history with the industry. You'd think that there'd be more studies and more papers written on it. So with all of that in mind, what drove your interest to write such a thorough historical paper on the paper industry in Wisconsin?
So, when I was doing my PhD in geography, I always long had an interest in historical geography, which is geographies of the past. And so, when I was working on my PhD, I really started to gain an interest in um, economic geography and how and firms ultimately could have an impact on communities and shape communities. So I think I was starting to really have an interest in that. Along the time, it was time to pick a topic, and at the same time, I moved to Wisconsin for personal reasons. Never lived in Wisconsin before. I grew up in Kansas on a farm. So I really had no prior knowledge or experience with the paper industry. Certainly didn't come from a family who long worked in the paper industry, so I'm kind of an outsider. And then I think it struck me as a very Wisconsin industry, very important industry to the state. So I thought it was kind of an opportunity to explore my interests in historical geography and, that relationship of businesses and firms to place. And also kind of explore specifically about an industry in my new adopted state. Um, and it took me a while to kind of flesh out what I would ultimately focus on in the paper. I think I there were, a lot of, business histories out there about specific mills. Certainly, there was a lot more written on the Fox River Valley for good reason, because that was kind of, a premier location. And not as much in the Wisconsin. So I decided I would focus my research on the Wisconsin River Valley in that dissertation, but it does draw, of course, I talk about um, some, briefly Fox River Valley and other places, but the core of the chapters focus on three communities in the Wisconsin River Valley. And I decided to pursue it from a geographical lens in that I wanted to kind of further just talk about what impact these businesses ultimately had on the towns in this region.
Well, and you mentioned that you came in sort of from an outsider's perspective, and I believe in the paper it said that this was a 5-year process of research and writing. And so, what sources did you find helpful? How did you delve into Wisconsin and learn more about what the historical paper industry was like?
Yeah, I spent a number of years researching. Um, I was working on it very part-time basis, so I was not a full-time endeavor on my part. I was working and raising a family. Um, so I say that because I almost wish I had 10 years of, and so I think there's more for me to learn. But really, when I was looking at this, I drew upon a lot of stuff. Certainly, there's older histories I read, people that had written about the topic before. I looked at, community histories, local histories that local historians had written about their communities. Um, census data, census of manufacturers data. I looked at company history. Sometimes companies or, paper mills, they would, post, if they had an important anniversary coming up, they would often like write up a history of their company. And certainly you can go to archives and find company files and read letters from owners of these mills. One important source I went to in my particular research, I always kind of credit this, is my visit to the Alexander House in Port Edwards, which is a really great archival resource. So if anyone's, it has a lot of research archival material for about the Nukusa Edwards Paper Company. So that was an important trip for me, looking at their resources, and I was kind of guided by um, Marshall Bueller, who is kind of a local or the company historian. So he's kind of an important uh, company historian and local historian for that area. So I wouldn't say there was one resource. There was a lot of different references I drew upon, and I always like to say there's way more that I feel like I've just scratched the surface. There's so much more for me to learn and read about.
With the Wisconsin River Valley, you mentioned, that's sort of a lesser talked about area, but what made you choose that specific area over, bigger paper making towns or areas per se?
Yeah, I think it was more so that um, I felt like the Fox River, kind of the Appleton, Neenah, Menasha area, and Kimberly Clark, those had kind of a bit more documentation or a bit more written about them. So I think I was looking for an area that had been less talked about. So I think that's what really solidified my decision. And with there, I think with Wisconsin, there was already a dissertation that was written, I think in the 60s, quite a big one about DC Everest and the Wausau region. So I kind of just shifted south, and I don't know why. I can't remember why I chose three, but to kind of center it, but it just three seemed like an appropriate number to kind of just hang the structure of the project on. Um, and with that, I just, as I was reading more and more, I settled upon Nakusa and Port Edwards and Wisconsin Rapids. Um, I could have written, probably there was some other communities I could have included again, but I had to also finish the project, at least get a start to it. So I settled upon the three.
It's very fleshed out. I mean, not just for the Wisconsin River Valley area, but I mean, you discussed the entire world almost, going back from the creation of paper to Europe to its transition into the North America. So it was very well done. And sort of going in a more broad sense, what about Wisconsin's geography gives such an advantage to paper mills?
Well, I think from a historical perspective, you certainly. It kind of depended on what you were looking at. We see that with the early paper mills kind of established in southeastern Wisconsin. Those are set up to really kind of supply some newsprint, and they're made out of rags. I think I recall reading about the Fox River, and those early mills were set up. They also produced rags, those very early mills along the Fox River. Some said it was kind of advantageous because you had this just kind of Fox River had a very clear water, and therefore it just made a nice little print or a pulp. Just not a lot of impurities in the water. So that and water is just always kind of an important resource. So of course those rivers are crucial. And then as the technology enabled the paper production to be uh, produced from wood as opposed to relying on recycled rags, um, do see, like, you have the natural resource, the ingredients, so to speak, um, very nearby. And then as you have these rivers, the rivers kind of really provide um, an important power source into producing and running the mills.
And before paper, it was more lumber focused, correct? There was more hardwood and wood used for boards and things like that. So, could you tell me a bit more about the lumber industry that was kind of before the paper industry really took off?
Yeah, certainly. In the Wisconsin River Valley, certainly in northern Wisconsin, we do see the rise of kind of lumber production starting around the 1830s into the 1840s. Um, we saw kind of small operations. We before in the 1830s and late 1820s, before Native Americans, indigenous populations fully had their land ceded. So you had even squatters kind of going out into these and illegally acquiring these materials. So um, I kind of make an argument in the dissertation. The federal government was kind of crucial in expanding that industry and allowing that industry to thrive because they did acquire land forcefully from Native American populations. And then once that happens, you do see the rise of kind of entrepreneurs coming in, setting up lumber mills and developing these lumber camps and then sawmill towns. And I think that you do see a stronger connection between with the decline of lumber in the Wisconsin River Valley, and the rise of the paper industry in the Wisconsin River Valley. And um, I think you in the Wisconsin River Valley, you saw on people who were owners of lumber mills or sawmills, and they saw the decline of the lumber industry, and then they actively invested into wood pulp mills or paper mills with that funds. So, kind of backing up a bit, with the why you saw the rise in such demand for lumber is at the same time that throughout the second half of the 19th century, we're seeing this kind of steady march westward by settlers, and with that, they're building towns. So they're building schools, they're building houses, they're building agricultural structures, all of which requires lumber. Um, and if you haven't read a book called Nature's Metropolis by William Cronin, absolute masterpiece. He kind of talks about this and the important role of Chicago in this nation building process. So that kind of funnels the demand for lumber. And then because of that, in Wisconsin, we see these settlements crop up. So we see kind of more short-term, small, bare-bones settlements for lumber camps, and we see these sawmill towns that emerge along the rivers. On the Wisconsin River in particular, as I mentioned just a minute ago, we do see some entrepreneurial, some businessmen that were invested in sawmills. They're seeing kind of the decline of sawmilling occurring in around the 1890s. And they actually decide to take their money and invest in the paper industry and in mills. So we do see a more of a direct connection there. Um, that's from my understanding on the Fox River Valley, it's a little bit different. And there you actually kind of saw more flour mills. And when we saw the flour milling industry kind of move towards Minneapolis, um, they moved to Superior as well. That's when you saw more investors switch to paper at that point.
And you mentioned the decline of the lumber, and is that due to sort of the unregulation, unlike how it is today, where forests are extremely well managed and are extremely taken care of? We want to replenish the forests, and back in the day, they sort of cut down all the white pines, which was needed for the lumber, but that also left the pulpwood to go towards the pulp mills. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, there was no real uh, sense of sustainability as it is today. It was you pretty much got what you need, and the development of railroads kind of further increased this decline of lumber resources because you could go take it into further reaches where you couldn't before when you were when if you were the lumber industry, if you were relying on kind of rivers to transport your logs, you were kind of a little limited. But now you could kind of not only use railroads to ship your logs, but you could also use railroads to get further inland and take people further inland to extract the resource. So, yes, as you saw that decline and the kind of the special exploitation of the white pine, you do see there was like less desirable wood left over. You could just grind that up, turn it into wood pulp, and so it was a convenient resource there.
And so, with the rise of the paper industry, would you say that it was the industry that sort of came first and then the workers settled to bring about the communities? Or would you say that people were coming into these towns, settling along the river, and then they happened to notice a potential for the paper mills and the sawmills? Which came first?
I think it's more the former, especially with the logging. It was more the resource, and then people would come. And I think in reading in some of these settlements, they might be a boarding house, kind of indicative that you have a more transient, younger population that's not necessarily intending to stay long term, or at least kind of they're just there to work. I think though, as time went on, you do of course attract other people and supporting industries into a population, and so um, obviously when you do see the lumber industry go into decline in some of these, town histories, you can see like documented concerns on the part of the population, like, oh, like, hey, we're really concerned about the future of our town now that lumber is really, as an industry, is really struggling. So you do see people kind of more attracted to these towns because of that, of the lumber industry. But once it declines, there is kind of a search for something that could be sustainable to assist in the economic development of these communities.
I think you can certainly see that in Wisconsin nowadays, where there's paper studies and colleges, and there's all sorts of different manufacturing facilities and converter facilities just to go along with the paper mills. Would you say that in that time period that these jobs were in high demand? Was it something that everyone in the community would be participating in the paper mills, or was it more that it started the process of building these communities and then people sort of moved around and started up these supply chains?
Oh, I think you see all of that. But I think you do see as the paper industry grows throughout kind of the early to middle part of the 20th century, I think you do see these uh, jobs are very well desired, um, and in demand in the sense that they are significant. Uh, they are important jobs for the community, and is a significant place of employment for a lot of these communities. And people who do get jobs, it's definitely a desirable place to work. And I mean, even would hear some comments, in talking to people like, "Oh yes, there might even sometimes be a little bit of tension or jealousy because these jobs became so nice, nicely well-paying jobs that there could be even some tension in some of these communities between people that worked in the mill and people that did not work in the mills. That was an interesting feature that I came across that I was not expecting.
No, that's very interesting, and like the gender discrepancy too. I'm sure that added some fuel to the fire, I suppose, since I believe it said when the technology advanced, and especially the move from rags to pulp, women weren't found in the paper mills as often since they used to be rag sorters. Could you expand more on that?
Yeah, and when the early paper mills, more so on the eastern United States, there was definitely a gendered breakdown in who did what in the paper mill. And rags came in, and women were employed and kind of doing a lot of sorting with that. And you don't tend to see that so much once the um, once the paper mills do switch to wood. It just becomes predominantly male. So I don't have. That would be interesting. Now I've got a question. I would like to know. Maybe I put it in the dissertation. I cannot remember it. I'd be interested to know, what that exact um, figure or number would be in that percentage and the proportion. I don't know if I have that great documented data as looking at, an Eastern paper mill in say 1820 and the gendered breakdown, and then comparing it to a 1920s uh, paper mill in Wisconsin relying on wood pulp. But I'd be very interested to see that if I could get those exact figures.
I think I remember during that portion that's discussed in your paper, I think you did add some statistics about the number of women in manufacturing in Europe and the slow decline after that transition is made from rags to paper to wood pulp. So I don't remember the exact page number, but I think you do add something like that in there. And yeah, that's just a very interesting way to look at things, and you wouldn't expect that that transition of material would cause such an effect on the gender in the paper mills.
Hmm. Yes, yeah, it's just a small piece, and now I had forgotten about that. I'm gonna look into that. I'm gonna have to look up what I wrote and look into it more. Thank you.
Yeah, so what would you say the biggest or the most long lasting impact of the paper industry has been on the communities in Wisconsin?
Well, I mean, I think it's amazing how profitable that some of these companies were. And I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about in the dissertation is how those companies ultimately kind of funneled those profits back into those communities. Um, so you do see cases where they're sponsoring parks. They're really um, trying to make these communities very strong, livable places and pleasant places to live. Um, so that's one thing. I think there is certainly in some communities um, a lot of their identity attached to the paper mill. And sometimes when a paper mill closes, there has to be a search for another identity associated with the town. I think Wisconsin Rapids is kind of in the middle of experiencing that right now. Um, so there's kind of very, very positive things in the sense that they were very profitable and very gave a lot of employment opportunities, steady employment opportunities. But sometimes when the economic wind shifted and you did have a change, a cycle, which is, you know, kind of a part of capitalism, but it stinks when you get caught in the middle of it. Um, you can really see those town identities kind of struggle. Um, but I mean, I think I'm less. I'm more kind of focused on the historical rather than the present. I'm not great insight into the present. But I watch to see, what happens to these mills. I'd love to see more of them reopen, and I hope they do. I'm look at, I find it interesting to see um, what companies are buying what. So yeah, I think it's amazing. It's some of these mills have been in the communities for well over 100 years. So it's interesting to see them kind of sustain that, and I'm interested to see where it goes. Does um, someone that's kind of again focused on the historical, can it shift? What is the kind of questioning of our use of plastic? So many, is there opportunities there? So um, I'd I'd like to see them kind of thrive again.
And that sort of leads me into my next question. We're talking about the impact of the paper industry on Wisconsin, and historically, it wasn't just about settling these communities, it was about forming them as well. You mentioned putting money into parks, into community centers, and giving workforce housing to their employees. But do you think, and not just for the paper industry, but maybe for businesses in general and manufacturers in general, do you think that in modern day those impacts are still happening? Do you think they're still forming communities in the way that they were when settlers were just coming in?
You know, I I remember, and I have not had a chance to read it. So if you have, I remember seeing an article about Amana, Iowa, trying to attract workers with better community amenities. So I hope I'm not messing that up. I wonder in this age where we still have kind of workforce shortages. I know tech, with the layoffs kind of there that gets a lot of news, but I think manufacturing is still looking for more people. And so I wonder if there might be as a way to adopt some of these strategies, this kind of where I talk about welfare capitalism in the dissertation, if there's some opportunities there to attract a labor force. So I'll be interested to see if that happens more often. I think we're seeing small hints of that. Uh, but as a whole, I wouldn't say it's widespread from what I've observed. But again, I'm kind of more focused on the past than the present. But I would be interested to see in this era if we can see more examples of them offering things like, attracting workers by maybe offering a discount on housing or offering other community benefits in order to attract people to work in a certain location.
I think that's certainly a direction that some industries are moving toward, especially the Wisconsin Paper Council. We recently started a workforce relations committee, and it's just really interesting to hear all the ideas coming from the industry about what they can do to attract workers. So I definitely think that we'll see some exciting things in the future. But that is all the time we have today. So thank you again to Dr. Katie Weichelt, author of the paper, A Historical Geography of the Paper Industry in the Wisconsin River Valley. Thank you for taking the time to discuss the history of the paper industry and Wisconsin. So there will be a link in the description if you're interested in reading the paper. And as always, thank you for listening to our podcast.
Thank you all.
Thank you for listening. For more information on the paper industry or the Wisconsin Paper Council, please visit www.wipaper.org. WPC members have access to special events, newsletters, committees, and more.